Your voice is nothing but noise. I am sick of hearing it.
The night my husband told me my voice was nothing but noise, I stopped speaking not because he had finally broken me, but because the security camera above his head had just sent every word to the attorney my father hired before he died. Hello, my name is Claire Whitmore. I am 43 years old, and until last winter, I lived in a quiet stone house outside Richmond, Virginia, with a man who believed silence meant surrender. His name was Grant. We had been married for 16 years. To our neighbors, Grant was charming, dependable, and successful. He remembered birthdays. He carried groceries for elderly women. At charity dinners, he placed a gentle hand against my back and told people I was the reason for everything good in his life. At home, that hand became a warning, not a fist. Grant was too careful for bruises. He controlled a room with a look, a sigh, or the slow tightening of his jaw. If I disagreed with him, he called me emotional. If I asked about money, he said I was ungrateful. If I spoke while he watched television, he raised the volume until my sentence disappeared. Over time, I began measuring every word before I said it. That Tuesday evening, I found an unfamiliar charge on our joint credit card, $12,800 paid to a company called Blackridge Consulting. Grant was pouring bourbon in the library when I asked about it. What is Blackridge? I said. He did not turn around. Business. Whose business? He smiled at his reflection in the dark window. Mine. I told him $12,000 was not a small expense. I reminded him that we had promised to discuss any charge over $2,000. That was when he turned and smirked. Claire, your voice is nothing but noise. He took a slow drink and studied my face. I have spent 16 years teaching you when to be quiet. Why are you still making me repeat myself? Something inside me went still. Above Grant's shoulder, almost invisible between two ceiling beams, a tiny green light blinked once. My father had installed the security system 10 years earlier. Grant believed he had disconnected every camera after Dad died. He had not known about the independent backup, or the private server attached to the alarm panel. Until that moment, neither had I. 3 days earlier, I had received a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was an old brass key and a note in my father's handwriting. If you are reading this, sweetheart, someone has tried to make you feel powerless in your own home. Go to the bank, ask for box 417, go alone. My father, Thomas Whitmore, had been dead for 4 years. He had built a regional construction company from one truck and a borrowed toolbox. He distrusted flashy people and complicated promises, but he believed in contracts, locks, and protecting the people he loved. I had not yet gone to the bank. Part of me feared the note was some cruel mistake. But when the green light blinked above Grant, I understood that Dad's message had not arrived late. It had arrived exactly when I needed it. I looked at Grant and said nothing. His smile widened. Finally, he whispered. He believed he had won. I walked upstairs, locked the bathroom door, and called the number written on the back of Dad's note. A woman answered after one ring. Whitmore Legal Protection, she said. As this Claire, my knees nearly gave way. Yes, my name is Evelyn Shaw. I represented your father. Are you safe to speak? I stared at my reflection. My face looked older than it had that morning. Not for long. Then listen carefully, she said. Do not confront your husband. Do not sign anything. Tomorrow at 10, go to First Commonwealth Bank and use the key. Your father left instructions that I contact you only if the home system detected specific signs of coercion. I lowered my voice. The cameras were watching us. Not continuously. The system flags certain phrases and financial events. Tonight it detected both. My skin turned cold. What financial event? There was a short pause. Grant attempted to borrow $3 million against your house. I gripped the sink. Our house. No, Claire. Your house. The bathroom doorknob moved. Grant knocked once. Who are you talking to? Evelyn heard him. End the call, she said. And remember this, your father expected Grant to come after the house. He made sure Grant could never own it. I hung up and turned on the shower. I'm talking to no one, I called. Grant stood outside the door for several seconds. Then I heard his footsteps move away. That night, he slept peacefully beside me. I did not sleep at all. At 9 the next morning, Grant announced that he had scheduled a meeting at home for noon. With whom? I asked. A financial advisor. There are papers you need to sign. What kind of papers? His eyes narrowed. Must every conversation with you become an interrogation? I lowered my gaze. No. He kissed my forehead as if rewarding a child. Good girl. Then he left for work. At 10, I entered First Commonwealth Bank and handed the brass key to the manager. She took me downstairs without asking for identification. Evelyn Shaw was waiting beside a steel table. She was in her 60s, with silver hair and a navy suit. In front of her sat a metal box marked for her 17. Inside were 3 folders, a flash drive, a sealed letter, and a photograph of my father holding me when I was 6. Evelyn opened the first folder. The deed to my house was held by the Whitmore Family Protection Trust. I was the sole beneficiary. Grant had no ownership interest and no authority to borrow against it. The second folder contained statements for investment accounts worth just over $8 million. My father had left them in trust, protected from marital claims and hidden from public probate records. The third folder was labeled Jurat Marsar. Inside were reports from a private investigator dating back 7 years, hotel receipts, secret loans, photographs of Grant meeting a woman I recognized as his business partner, Vanessa Cole, copies of emails discussing my assets. One sentence had been highlighted. Once Claire signs, the house becomes collateral. After that, she can complain all she wants. She'll have nowhere to go. I felt as if the floor had shifted beneath me. My father knew. I asked. He suspected? Evelyn said. But he also knew you would not leave Grant simply because he told you to. So he created protections and waited for you to see the truth yourself. I looked at the clock. 11:23. Grant's advisor would arrive at noon. Evelyn slid one final document toward me. It was a temporary order preventing any transfer, loan, or alteration involving the trust property. A judge had signed it that morning. What do I do now? I asked. Evelyn's expression hardened. Go home, she said. Let Grant hand you the papers. We need to know how far he is willing to go. When I returned, a black Mercedes was parked outside my house. Grant sat at the dining table with a man named Peter Lang, who introduced himself as a financial restructuring specialist. A neat stack of documents waited beside my chair. Yellow arrows marked every place where I was supposed to sign. Grant pulled out my seat. This will take 5 minutes, he said. I sat down and read the first page. It was not ordinary refinancing paperwork. It transferred management authority over all household assets to Mercer Development Group, Grant's failing company. Why does your company need authority over the house? I asked. Peter adjusted his glasses. It is a standard temporary structure. Then why does page 14 give Grant permanent power of attorney? Grant's pleasant expression disappeared. Peter looked surprised that I had read that far. Claire, Grant said. We discussed your habit of turning simple matters into noise. He pushed a pen toward me. I picked it up. For one hopeful second, his shoulders relaxed. Then I placed the pen across the paper and said, I want my own attorney to review this. Grant leaned close enough that I could smell coffee on his breath. You do not have an attorney. The front door opened behind him. Evelyn entered with a court officer and a process server. She does now, Evelyn said. The server handed Grant the judge's order. Peter stood so quickly that his chair fell backward. Grant read the first page, then the second. Color drained from his face. This is ridiculous. That house belongs to us. It belongs to the Whitmore Trust. Evelyn replied. You have never owned one brick. Grant turned toward me. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. You planned this. I could have shouted. Instead I spoke gently. No. My father did. Peter grabbed his briefcase and announced that the meeting was over. Evelyn stopped him at the door. Mr. Lang, knowingly presenting a fraudulent power of attorney may interest the state bar and the police. His face collapsed. Grant told me she agreed. He said. He said she was nervous, but compliant. That word hurt more than I expected. Grant had not merely hoped I would sign. He had described my obedience as if it were an asset he owned. Peter left his documents and departed with the officer. Grant waited until the door closed before dropping his mask. You humiliated me. You tried to steal my house. I was saving my company. With my signature. With our resources. My father's resources. Grant slammed his palm against the table. Your father is dead. The old me would have flinched. The woman sitting there did not. His protections are very much alive. Grant stormed upstairs. 10 minutes later, I heard drawers opening and closing. I thought he was packing. Instead, he returned carrying my laptop, my passport, and a small wooden box containing my mother's jewelry. Until you come to your senses, I will hold these. He walked toward the garage. I pressed the emergency button Evelyn had given me. The garage door would not open. The security system locked every exterior exit except the front door, and sent a live alert to the court officer still parked nearby. Grant stared at the red light on the wall panel. Then a calm recorded voice filled the hallway. Protected property removal detected. Video preservation activated. Grant slowly turned toward me. What did your father put in this house? Apparently, something that recognizes a thief. The officer returned and instructed Grant to place my belongings on the floor. He was not arrested because I chose not to press charges that afternoon. That was not mercy. I needed him careless, not cornered. Grant packed 2 suitcases and moved into a downtown hotel. Before leaving, he stopped on the porch. You think you are powerful because of a dead man's money, he said, but you still have no idea how the real world works. Maybe not, I replied. But I am learning how you work. The next morning, Vanessa Cole called me. She said she wanted to explain. We met in a crowded cafe. She arrived wearing dark glasses, though it was raining. Vanessa denied having an affair with Grant. Then I placed one hotel photograph between us. She removed her glasses. He told me your marriage had been over for years. Did he also tell you the house was his? Her silence answered me. Vanessa confessed that Mercer Development was nearly bankrupt. Grant had used client deposits to cover older debts. Blackridge Consulting was not a real consulting company. It was a shell entity controlled by Vanessa's brother, the $12,800. I asked, a test transfer. Grant wanted to know whether you watched the account. And when he thought I did not. He planned to move $400,000. My stomach tightened. Vanessa reached for her bag. I should go. Why did you call me? Tears gathered in her eyes. Because Grant said if the loan failed, he would tell investigators everything was my idea. She slid a flash drive across the table. The company books are on there. He thinks I destroyed them. Before I could touch it, a man at the next table stood up and left. Vanessa went pale. That man works for Grant. She pushed back her chair and rushed toward the kitchen exit. My phone vibrated. It was a message from Grant. You should be more careful about the company you keep. Attached was a photograph of me and Vanessa taken less than 30 seconds earlier. Grant was no longer trying to silence me inside our home. He was watching me outside it. Evelyn moved me to a secure apartment that afternoon. I hated leaving my home, but she reminded me that safety was not surrender. We gave Vanessa's flash drive to a forensic accountant named Daniel Ruiz. By midnight, he had found enough irregularities to keep federal investigators busy for months. Grant had diverted more than $2 million from construction clients. He moved money through Blackridge, falsified invoices, and used new deposits to conceal unfinished projects. Then Daniel found something worse. 3 years earlier, Grant had created a life insurance policy on me worth $5 million. The signature looked like mine. It was not. Can a husband legally do that? I asked. Not with a forged consent form, Evelyn said. The room seemed to shrink. I remembered the loose stair rail Grant kept promising to repair, the carbon monoxide alarm he removed because it was too sensitive, the herbal sleeping drops he had begun placing beside my tea. Perhaps each detail meant nothing by itself. Together, they formed a shadow I could no longer ignore. Evelyn called the police. While detectives investigated, Grant filed for divorce. His complaint described me as unstable, paranoid, and financially irresponsible. He requested emergency control of the marital home and claimed I had been manipulated by my father's former attorney. Then he did something that nearly destroyed me. He released edited recordings of our private arguments online. In the clips, my voice sounded sharp and angry. His responses sounded calm. He removed everything he had said before I raised my voice. Friends began calling. Some asked if I needed help. Others said nothing but stopped answering my messages. Grant gave an interview to a local business podcast. I love my wife, he said. But grief changed her. She has become obsessed with the idea that her late father is still controlling our lives. For 2 days I wanted to disappear. On the third morning, Evelyn placed Dad's sealed letter in front of me. I think it is time. My hands shook as I opened it. Claire, if Grant has forced you to open this box, I am sorry. I hoped my doubts were wrong. I also know you may be angry that I investigated your husband. You would be right. A father's love does not excuse every intrusion. But I saw him reduce your world one small piece at a time. I watched you apologize before speaking. I watched you stop singing in the kitchen because he said it distracted him. I watched the strongest person I knew begin asking permission to exist. The trust is not your rescue. Money cannot rescue you. The house cannot rescue you. They are only tools, kept outside his reach until you remember that your life belongs to you. There is one more protection. Evelyn will explain it when you are ready. Love, Dad, I cried until I could not see the page. When I finally looked up, Evelyn opened a file on her tablet. 4 years earlier, Dad had loaned Grant's company $600,000. Grant had hidden the loan from me and never repaid it. Under the agreement, default transferred Grant's voting interest in Mercer Development to the Whitmore Trust. How much of his company? I asked. 51%. I stared at her. My father owned his company. No. The trust had a secured right to take control after default. Your father never exercised it because he feared Grant would punish you. Now you are trustee, and Grant has just missed his final payment. For 16 years, Grant had told me I understood nothing about business. By Friday afternoon, I controlled his company. We called an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. Grant learned about it on Sunday night. He came to the secure apartment and pounded on the lobby door until security threatened to call police. Then he called me 11 times. I answered the 12th. You cannot take my company, he shouted. You used my father's money to save it. That was a private agreement. It was a legal agreement. His voice changed. The anger disappeared, replaced by the warm tone he used during the early years of our marriage. Claire, come home. We can fix this. Vanessa meant nothing. The loan was temporary. I was under pressure. For a moment, I heard the man I once loved. Then I remembered he had forged my name on a $5 million insurance policy. Did you ever love me? I asked. Of course. Then why did you need me silent? He did not answer. That silence told me everything. On Monday morning, Grant walked into Mercer Development's conference room expecting frightened employees and loyal directors. Instead, he found Evelyn, Daniel, 2 independent board members, a federal investigator, and me seated at the head of the table. His nameplate had been moved to the far end. You are in my chair, he said. Not anymore. Evelyn, read the notice of default. The trust exercised its voting rights and removed Grant as chief executive pending investigation. I expected him to explode. He laughed. You think this company is worth something, he said. It is drowning. Congratulations, Claire. Your father left you a corpse. Daniel placed a report on the table. Not quite, he said. The profitable contracts were transferred last month to another entity. Grant's smile vanished. The receiving company was Blackridge Consulting. Vanessa's brother owned it on paper, but Daniel had traced the real beneficial owner. It was Grant. He had stripped Mercer Development of its best assets and planned to let the original company collapse after using my house to secure one final loan. The federal investigator stood. Mr. Mercer, we need to discuss those transfers. Grant looked at me with pure hatred. This is not over. He was right. The worst thing he had done had not yet been discovered. The investigation into the life insurance policy led detectives to Grant's private storage unit. Inside, they found forged documents, prepaid phones, copies of my medical records, and a folder labeled CWEXIT. The folder contained a proposed divorce settlement that would have left me with almost nothing. It also contained notes about my medication, my daily walking route, and the faulty railing at the rear staircase. There was no written murder plan. Grant was not that careless. But one message to Vanessa was impossible to explain away. If Claire has another accident, the insurance solves everything. Vanessa claimed she thought he was making a sick joke. The prosecutor did not laugh. Grant was arrested on fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and witness intimidation charges. The investigation into his plans for me remained open. He posted bail and arrived at our divorce hearing wearing the same navy suit he had worn to my father's funeral. He still believed presentation could defeat evidence. His attorney argued that the trust was designed to cheat Grant out of marital property. Evelyn produced the original deed, trust records, tax filings, and 16 years of documentation proving the house and inherited funds had always been separate. Then Grant's attorney attacked the recordings. He claimed the home security system violated Grant's privacy and that my father had built an illegal surveillance network. Evelyn explained that the cameras covered common areas, had been disclosed in the home insurance documents, and were activated by security events. Grant himself had signed the acknowledgement when the system was installed. He had simply assumed no one would ever use it against him. The judge allowed the recordings. Grant's voice filled the courtroom. Your voice is nothing but noise. I have spent 16 years teaching you when to be quiet. Later came his order to sign the financial papers and his attempt to remove my passport and jewelry. The judge watched Grant without expression. My husband stared straight ahead. Then Evelyn played the unedited versions of the conversations Grant had released online. The public heard what came before my anger: the insults, threats, lies, and careful pressure. One local reporter published the full timeline that afternoon. The people who had doubted me began sending apologies. Some were sincere, some were simply afraid of having supported the wrong person. I learned that forgiveness does not require renewed access. I accepted a few apologies and ignored the rest. The court confirmed that Grant had no claim to the house or the trust. Because he had attempted to conceal and waste marital assets, The judge awarded me a larger share of what remained in our joint accounts. That alone would have been justice. But I wanted something more useful than watching Grant lose. As controlling shareholder of Mercer Development, I faced a choice. I could shut it down and sell what remained, leaving 82 innocent employees without jobs. Or I could rebuild it. Grant had always said I knew nothing about business. He was right about one thing: I did not know enough. So I hired people who did. Daniel became interim chief financial officer. Vanessa cooperated with prosecutors and resigned. We recovered the stolen contracts from Blackridge through a court order. We contacted every client, admitted what had happened, and offered independent audits of their projects. The process was painful. We lost money, we lost contracts, but we did not lose the company. 6 months later, Mercer Development reopened under a new name, Whitmore Renewal Group. Our first major project was not a luxury tower or private resort, it was a transitional housing center for women escaping financial and emotional abuse. We named it the Thomas House. I kept my own home, but I changed almost everything inside it. Grant's dark library became a music room. I removed the enormous television he used to drown me out. I painted the walls a warm cream color and opened the curtains he always kept closed. The first morning after the renovation, I stood in the kitchen and sang while making coffee. My voice shook. I missed notes. Halfway through, I began crying. Then I laughed and kept singing. Grant eventually accepted a plea agreement. He received prison time, restitution orders, and a permanent ban from serving as an officer of any company handling client funds. The divorce became final 2 weeks before sentencing. At the last hearing, he asked to speak to me privately. I refused, but I allowed him to address me with our attorneys present. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not weaker, just exposed. "Your father destroyed my life," he said. I waited. "Do you have nothing to say?" Once? That question would have pulled a river of explanations from me. I would have defended myself, pleaded for understanding, and tried to make him admit the truth. I did not need his understanding anymore. "My father did not destroy your life," I said. "He put locks around mine. You destroyed yourself trying to break through them." Grant looked toward the attorneys, searching for an audience he could still charm. No one moved. "You were nothing before me," he whispered. I almost smiled. "That was your favorite lie." Then I walked away. A year has passed since the night he called my voice noise. I now speak at every board meeting. I ask questions until I understand the answers. I disagree without apologizing. When someone interrupts me, I finish my sentence. At the Thomas House, there is a small recording room where residents can tell their stories if they choose. No cameras are forced on them. No names are published without permission. Some women speak for an hour. Some need weeks before they can say one full sentence. I understand both. People sometimes describe my ending as revenge. Perhaps part of it was. I will never pretend I felt nothing when Grant lost the company he tried to save by stealing my future. But revenge was not the best part. The best part was learning that silence and weakness are not the same thing. My quietness gave me room to listen, investigate, prepare, and choose the right moment. Grant mistook my silence for an empty house. He never realized it was a locked room, where my courage was growing. And when I finally opened that door, the voice he called noise became the last sound his lies could not survive.